The genesis of Africa's debt crisis. In the early 1970s, some oil-producing countries created a united front through the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries (OPEC) and increased their oil price to gain additional revenue. They invested the excess petrodollars in banks in the United States and Europe. In addition, European banks were awash with cash because the Marshall Plan had worked and the economies were growing again. The Marshall Plan was an aid package from the United States worth $13 billion given to Western European nations between 1948 and 1951 to rebuild their economies after World War II. In turn, these banks started lending this excess money to developing countries at low interest rates. The developing countries were then encouraged to use these loans to finance the purchase of machinery, goods, and services from the same industrialized countries, and in the process, stimulating their production bases. In some developing countries, though, this cash windfall was borrowed in huge amounts by the political elites and often wasted on luxuries and sustainable white elephant projects, and in some cases, outrightly stolen by corrupt officials. This honeymoon of developing countries that had taken out low-interest loans from US and European banks came to an end. They now had to pay back the loans with huge interest rates because of the world recession of the early 1980s. The lender banks increased the interest rates. This was the genesis of Africa's debt crisis. Developing countries soon found out that their debts were unsustainable. They had to take up new loans to service the pre-existing loans to avoid a default that could lead to bankruptcy status. This is where the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund stepped in by taking up the task of making sure that developing countries continued paying back their debt. Since the 1970s, structural adjustment programs, SAPs, were prescribed in many developing countries by the Bretton Woods institutions, namely the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The programs were imposed as a condition for further loans. SAPs were as a result of the debt crisis that hit the developing countries. They offered new loans to countries that accepted to undergo the structural adjustment program. The disparity in trade under the stipulation of the World Trade Organization (WTO) between the developed and the impoverished nations also compounded the problem of poverty. Developing nations could not sell their finished products except certain raw materials on the international market. The original intent of the World Bank was to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. After World War II, the International Monetary Fund was to facilitate trade and to make short-term loans available to countries with temporary balance of payment problems. Over time, the World Bank and the IMF have assumed much more power and influence over the economic policies of many countries. About 187 countries make up the membership of these two institutions, but influence exerted on the decision-making process is determined by the amount of subscriptions each member country makes. Since the system is based on $1, one vote, richer countries are the principal shareholders and they command a leading role in determining the policies and direction of the World Bank and the IMF.